August is here, and that means that the weather and the election cycle are heating up. The best way to beat the heat and stay up to date on the latest news from the US election to international breaking headlines is to become a DSR member and gain access to additional content across our network, in addition to other exclusive benefits. Use code BEATTHEHEAT to get 50% off of your membership and sign up today at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's Beat the Heat at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. By now you've heard that Donald Trump's campaign aides had a physical confrontation with an official at Arlington National Cemetery who tried to prevent Trump's people from filming in a restricted area, which apparently violated the law. The Trump campaign subsequently exacerbated matters by smearing the official in vile terms and blithely posting video of the event online. We think this scandal will get worse for Trump. It just took a dark turn Thursday when the Army sharply and publicly rebuked his campaign. And Democratic senators are now getting involved, which means we may get a fuller accounting sooner rather than later. Today we're talking about all this with Jonathan Bernstein, a political scientist who has an excellent new piece up on his Substack arguing that Team Trump's actions are a sign of something ominous, the deterioration of the rule of law. We're going to talk about that much bigger story here. Great to have you on, Jonathan.
Good to be here.
To quickly recap, the Army put out a scalding statement on Thursday that basically said the Trump campaign had been informed in advance that the political activity it undertook at Arlington was prohibited by federal law. The Army said the employee trying to ensure adherence to the law was pushed aside. The Army also rebuked the Trump campaign for attacking this employee, which included questioning her mental health and patriotism. The Army statement is really disturbing, isn't it, Jonathan?
Yeah. I mean, this is a real incident. To the extent that the law is still important, they seem to have broken the law. Look, you're not supposed to use Arlington National Cemetery for campaign purposes. And nobody does that. I mean, who does that kind of thing? Who goes in and does a thumbs up picture, trampling over other graves? I mean, people really care about Arlington National Cemetery. And I don't know how this is going to work out campaign-wise. I never make predictions about how things play out in the campaign. But in terms of what it says about Trump personally and about the people he surrounds himself with, pushing aside physical confrontations with people, it's a big deal.
It absolutely is. And then there was another turn in this story. Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, gave me a statement saying he wants the Army to provide the incident report it filed on what happened. I can also report something else. Senate Armed Services Committee staff has been in direct touch with Army officials about the incident and is likely to request a full accounting, a congressional aide tells me. Now, for listeners, the Army manages Arlington via the Office of Army Cemeteries. So this incident seems squarely within the Senate Armed Service Committee's jurisdiction, its oversight jurisdiction. Jonathan, what do you think of the potential role of oversight here?
Look, I'm all for Congress holding oversight hearings on things. And if it's one of the things that the current Senate has not been particularly aggressive about is using the format they have. Democrats, with the majority in the Senate, has not been particularly aggressive about doing campaign-related things. Congress should be aggressive in overseeing the federal government, including the Army, including Arlington Cemetery. And there's no particular reason they should back off this just because it's campaign-related.
Okay, a big part of this story is that the woman, the Arlington official who was shoved aside, declined to press charges because she reportedly feared retaliation from the Trump campaign. You wrote a piece for your Substack, which is called Good Politics, Bad Politics. that says that this alone is a bad sign of the rule of law deteriorating. You argued that she doesn't think she can publicly tell the truth about a violation of the law without facing vengeance and violence, as you put it, and that is something we should care deeply about. Can you talk about that?
This is part of a broader context, a very important context of Trump and his supporters using intimidation, threats of violence, actual violence, rather than, what you're supposed to use in a democracy, which is argument and convincing and the kind of things, democratic discussion that you're supposed to have. It goes back to Trump supporters running a campaign bus off the road in Texas during one of the previous campaigns. It goes to intimidating judges, jurors, court personnel in his trials and in other trials. There's just a long, threats to elected officials are way up. And it's not just that his supporters are doing this, because the truth is there's cranks on every side who do crazy things occasionally, way more right now among Trump supporters. And because Trump incites this stuff. And of course, the big one is January 6th, but it's a constant drumming of things. And it gets to the point where, you can't have democracy if ordinary citizens are intimidated from working the polls, which is a lot of people have resigned that job that had done it for decades. And then we're seeing the actual, the little old ladies who stand behind the desk when you vote, all the way up to county level administrators who are walking off the job because they're scared and they're not willing to take the risks of doing this. The two poll workers in Atlanta who Rudy Giuliani was sued and is going to pay up, we think, because he defamed them because they came up with some maybe crazy conspiracy theory of what they were doing when in fact they weren't doing it at all. But the question is, if you're going to be thinking about this November counting ballots, which you need a lot of people to do that. There's we've seen the counting rooms and the recounts where there's a huge number, manpower need. Are you going to do that if you know that you might become the target of Fox News, of right-wing radio, and of the potential president of the United States? But even if he loses, of his thugs who are trying to ruin people's lives with his approval and his very public approval of that kind of thing.
I mean, it's beyond doubt that this atmosphere of threats, violence, thuggery, and intimidation is just ever present in the MAGA movement. We've seen it on many other fronts, as you say. There's the harassment and intimidation of poll workers. To the threats of violence against elected officials, I'd add there was the open celebration of the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. And by the way, I'd add something about January 6th, which you brought up, which is the transformation of the January 6th rioters into patriots and heroes says, in effect, that political violence on Trump's behalf is an affirmative good. That is what they mean by that. It is a direct statement of this principle. Now, in your piece, you write that American democracy has generally proven resilient against this kind of stuff, but also that our history says this kind of thing can actually work. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what happened in the South after Reconstruction. And I have to admit, I'm not a 19th century expert, but the basic story of Jim Crow is that a combination of state-run and non-state thuggery, that kept people from voting, kept people from having rights. A lot of, some of that stuff was laws that were passed, but a lot of it was just intimidation against Black citizens in the South who lost their citizenship, de facto, because they knew that, well, if you use that drinking fountain or if you try to vote, you could get strung up, literally. You could get lynched, literally, for those sorts of things. And that lasted for decades. So, on the one hand, I do think that we shouldn't panic. We shouldn't be despondent. People can fight back against these things. But at the same time, it is absolutely the case that democracy doesn't necessarily win, and if it does, it may be decades before it does. So the need to guard against stuff like this, and it's very hard to guard against it, because you have a movement which is a big chunk of the Republican Party getting told by their leader, as you said, Greg, yes, this is exactly what you should be doing.
That is exactly what he's saying. I want to bring up something else that's happening here as well, which is the systematic erosion of the idea that the military should be kept walled off from political manipulation and use in political propaganda. To take another big context here, Trump calls generals my generals. He recently at a rally described Keith Kellogg, who was there at the rally, as a real general, meaning one who supports him as opposed to fake ones. And remember, Jonathan, in 2020, military officials had to issue statements affirming that their commitments were to the Constitution and not to Trump, after he tried to use them as props for a photo op at Lafayette Square when the protesters were cleared away with some violence. And Trump is campaigning on an explicit threat to send the military into blue states against their will to carry out his agenda, whether it's mass deportations or whatever the hell he thinks he's going to do. So this Arlington thing is another example of that erosion, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, the thing is that Trump himself, I often say he doesn't believe in the rule of law. And what I mean by that isn't so much that he disagrees with it. He doesn't fathom it. I don't think that the man understands that there's such a thing as the rule of law and that there's any advantage. I don't think it occurs to him that, the military actually has been independent. It's a source of enormous strength to our nation, that our military can be trusted 100%, or up through this point, it can be trusted 100% to support the government, and is not going to do the things that Trump asked them to do. The problem, of course, is that he had 4 years to promote people that he liked and not that he didn't like. And if he has 4 more years to do that with even fewer constraints, we may not have an independent military anymore. We may have, what he wants, which is a military that's subservient to him and that does what he wants. And if that's the case, then, we won't have democracy at all. And it's, again, what's the likely outcome is somewhere in the middle, that there's some resistance, but it's scary and dangerous stuff. And it's something that at the federal level, like this, we haven't seen in the country, even though we have had certainly a lot of difficulties over the centuries, but nothing quite like this.
I want to try to build on that a little bit. When you see Trump do all those things that we discussed, when you see top Trump campaign aides viciously, shamelessly smear the Arlington official for trying to uphold the law, I think they're flaunting their contempt for the law and for the separation of the military from politics. The military should be only on our side and against them, and anyone who isn't with us on that, well, they can go to hell, as J.D. Vance put it at a rally or at an event recently. Is that another way to think about the deterioration we're seeing here?
Yeah, absolutely. And my understanding of, and who knows what goes in anybody's mind, but my understanding of Trump's mind is that if people are not absolutely 100% perfectly loyal to him at every juncture, he doesn't really sort of understand that there can be people who have things like honor and responsibility and duty to the nation. That's just, it doesn't exist in his world. So they must be scheming with Barack Obama or with Hillary Clinton or with whoever it is that he thinks is pulling the strings today, or with Harris. And the problem is that the more that he does that, the more that he puts those conspiracy type of thinking out there, the more that his followers believe it. And people aren't apt to think that the president or the nominee from your side, if you happen to be a Republican, is flat out lying about the world. And he is. And it's terribly dangerous. And like I said, the truth is that the tradition of an independent, democracy-supporting military is really one of the great achievements of our nation. I think if you asked the people who sort of do system-wide political science about democracy, they would put that in the top 5 achievements of the nation. But it's not guaranteed. And there's plenty of nations that have coups by the military, or that have either by the military or backed by the military. And that's the question of what's important. And it's never happened here like that. And we don't know how strong the tradition will be faced with another 4 years or more of that kind of president.
Can I ask you, Jonathan, it seems to me that Trump in 2024 is campaigning even more explicitly on the rejection of all those principles you're talking about. And so in 2016, he was the guy who was going to break up the establishment. He was running against financial elites, right? It was all about trade and immigration and plenty of racism thrown in, but that was more his focus. In 2020, he was the guy who had crushed COVID and eliminated it as a problem from American life. But now, on one front after another, he's explicitly and openly and vocally rejecting all these higher principles. And so I wonder whether, if he were to somehow win, whether that's even more dangerous, because he won on a platform of explicit rejection of the rule of law in every way. I mean, I should add that, he's saying, I will pardon the January 6th rioters because what they did is a good thing. That is his position. Let's be clear, right? He's saying that he will cancel, he's not saying this openly, but he will cancel all prosecutions into himself because they're all inherently corrupt. Any application of the law to him and his movement is inherently corrupt. And he will take DOJ and turn it loose on his opponents without cause. And so he's openly, explicitly campaigning on this stuff. I don't know how to think about that, except to think if he wins, that's bad.
Yeah, no, I first of all, I completely agree with you. And what, he, in 2016, he ran on being a bigot. In 2024, he's running on being an authoritarian. And that's just what it is. I mean, there's no question about it or ambiguity about it. He's running on an authoritarian, that he should be the dictator of the nation. There are, people say, well, there's no guardrails this time. The nation has, the constitutional system has guardrails. Whether they'll hold and to what extent that they'll hold, we don't know. What we do know is that politicians try to keep their promises. And even Trump keeps promises. And the promises that are important are not necessarily the specific policy things that you talk about. It's what your general thrust is, what your general, the big themes. That they try to keep those things. The only question then is, does he get his way or not? Not will he try to do these things? Of course, he did in the first place in his term of office, but I think much more so this time. He will be very open about that being the case. And of course, you mentioned, the indictments are a big part of that, which is that he basically has, if he doesn't intervene, he's going to be convicted. He's going to wind up.
Yes.
So, it's not like a mystery of whether he would do these things, because of course he's going to do those things.
He is going to do those things. And so let's bring this back to the role that Senate Democrats can play here. Your basic point, if I understand you correctly, in a nutshell, is that this thing that's happening at Arlington might look like a moment-to-moment dust-up in a campaign. We have had fights before about the politicization of such sites as this one. This has happened in campaigns. But this one seems representative of something much larger, which I think should require Senate Democrats to step up and say, you know what, we've got to treat this as important. We've got to tell people, we've got to tell the public that it's important. Use our institutional influence and clout to do that. So we are going to say to the U.S. Army, tell us what happened. Let's inform the public fully about what actually happened here. I mean, don't you think they need to really step up?
What I think is that, yes, that's a fine idea. I think that all of us, it's incumbent on all of us to make it clear what the stakes of the election are, and that this is not, and to make sure that when we talk about stuff like this, that we keep the larger context in mind. Again, look, he shouldn't have done the thing in the first place. The context here is the disregard for the law and for the rule of law, and that stuff is really important.
No question about it. Jonathan Bernstein, thanks so much for coming on with us, man. Good to see you.
Good to talk to you.
Folks, make sure to check out some new content we have up at TNR.com. Alex Shepard pointing out that the Democrats are indeed united, but asking, now what? And Grace Seegers looking at the huge gap in star power between the two parties. The Democrats have A-list star power, and the Republicans have Hulk Hogan. We'll see you all Tuesday. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.